Hi, everyone. Well, there was a news story from NBC in San Francisco. They've been doing excellent local reporting on the Millennium Tower saga. I'm here to give you more of the technical background with some of these top line news stories. But I'll just roll this here. They're talking about surprising developments with the settlement of the center of the foundation of the building.
Well, more trouble for the troubled Millennium Tower. It's been 6 months since the luxury high-rise was fully supported to stop it from sinking and leaning.
NBC investigative reporter Jackson Vanderbrecken has learned that the high-rise is no longer sinking any further to the side, but now it appears to be sinking in the middle.
Fix engineers had predicted once that was done, the tower's weight would shift onto the other sides and eventually right the tower by as much as 4 inches. But they now acknowledge that projection was overly optimistic, saying the soil under the building is not acting as predicted. Instead of sinking at the opposite edges and offsetting more of the tilt, the tower now appears to be sinking in the center.
With all tall buildings, there is a tendency, even though the foundation mat may be quite thick, there is a tendency for the center to settle more than the edges.
Now, I have experience designing large mat foundations, and you can make them 5-10 feet thick, heavily reinforced, but if they're big enough, they'll still perform as if they're flexible. If they were perfectly rigid, whatever load was applied to the top of the mat would be evenly distributed across the foundation. And as a practical matter, that rarely happens, so that the loads are typically transferred in a more localized distribution immediately underneath the point of load application. It's not uniformly spread out across the whole foundation, again, as if it would have been in the case of a rigid foundation.
Geotechnical engineer Robert Pike says center sinking, known as dishing, can trigger cracking under the foundation.
That should have been obvious that there was a possibility of further increase in cracking and water intrusion into the foundation.
Pike says this buried wall under the opposite side of the foundation may be another hitch. Engineers figured the wall would sink when more weight was shifted onto it and help right the building a bit. But so far, Pike says, monitoring data shows the wall is holding fast.
So let's do a brief recap. I know I've done multiple videos on this topic, but some of you may not have seen all of them, or some of you may not have seen any of them. But in essence, this building was constructed from a period of 2004 to 2009, and it was designed to be supported by relatively shallow, for this area of San Francisco, pile foundation, concrete pile foundation, 960 driven pile to a depth of about 80 feet below grade to tip into a marine sand layer. Now, there's been some speculation as to whether the original design engineer understood that this was going to end up being a reinforced concrete building instead of a much lighter structural steel building. But at any rate, in 2009, when the geotechnical engineer who did this original design was brought in to look at, hey, we're getting way more settlement than you predicted. They predicted around 4 or 5 inches over the 50-plus year lifespan for the building, and instead they had in excess of 9 inches, and they were just finishing construction of the building. And that would have been a good time for them to say, hey, we didn't know this was going to not be a structural steel building. But to my knowledge, that was never discussed. So I have to only think that they just had a bust in their design and didn't appreciate that the amount of loading over such a wide area would cause significant stress increase in the underlying marine clay layers, which would cause what is called consolidation settlement, both primary and secondary. And secondary can go on for a very, very long time, and in some cases can exceed the amount of primary consolidation. So it's not a good scenario. So fast forward to 2021 timeframe, a so-called fix was going to be implemented. Originally, they were going to install 52 perimeter pile to stabilize the part of the building that had settled the most, and then thinking that they would hold that portion of the building fast and let other parts of the building settle. There was an alternate proposal to basically install micropile in a uniform distribution across the entire footprint of the mat foundation, which would have technically been a far better, far superior methodology for remediating this foundation. Instead, they elected to go with this plan for 52 perimeter piling. And they ran into some trouble, and they ended up going with 18 pile. I'm going to come back to that. But what struck me about this whole story is not that things seem to go counter on an ongoing basis to what was originally predicted and told to the public. I've come to the realization that the people involved with this so-called repair, really, it doesn't matter what happens. They're going to tell you everything's according to plan, or if it wasn't according to plan, it's still okay. And that's what I want to focus on in this video, because it's quite a phenomenon. It is the polar opposite in a way of the lack of information or lack of reliable information that I encountered when I was researching Three Gorges Dam in China. You have essentially propaganda on either side or unreliable information, and you just don't know where you stand relative to the performance of that dam on the Yangtze River. In this case, there's loads and loads of data, and in the face of other very experienced engineers who have criticized this repair methodology, as well as the implications for long-term performance, particularly with regard to a major earthquake, they've raised serious concerns about this foundation so-called fix. And the engineer involved, primarily Ron Hamburger, is just completely dismissive of the findings. And again, there's extensive monitoring data. So the monitoring appears to be merely a requirement from the building department in San Francisco. I've commented in previous videos, these are data reports only. There's no analysis, no discussion about, hey, this is what's happening and this is either consistent or it's inconsistent with what we predicted. No analysis whatsoever. So I want to basically show you in this video how you cannot, in my opinion, trust the narrative that's being pushed out there by the people involved with this so-called repair of this building.
The designer of the fix project, Ron Hamburger, told us in a statement the remainder of the building continues to settle as we always anticipated, resulting in tilt recovery, albeit at a slightly lower rate than modeling predicted. He added, "We believe the lower rate of settlement was because stress relief on the soils under the building has been more effective than originally forecast."
So let's start out with some statements made by Ron Hamburger. He's with the firm Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager, the engineer of record for the so-called repair plan. So the objective was to install these, what started out to be 52 pile and then ended up being only 18 pile, and I'll mention why here in a second, at the perimeter building to arrest settlement and tilt, and then assure that the building can provide the seismic performance intended of a new structure designed to San Francisco current building code and improve the seismic performance of the foundation. Then he goes on in this he made a presentation at a structural engineering conference in Kansas a few years ago. And he said, the building seismic response considering settlement is essentially the same as that neglecting it. So overall, the foundation had as much as 19 inches of settlement and 30 inches of tilt at the top floor of the building in the northwest direction. So what he's saying here is that, even if we don't do anything, the building's fine from a seismic performance standpoint, which again has been disputed by several experts. Then he says building essentially meets criteria for new buildings designed using performance-based procedures. Well, essentially and exactly meeting the code are two different things, so it doesn't exactly meet the code requirements. The settlement has not substantially affected the building's adequacy. Again, that's subject to some debate, I think. Now, he's made this statement here, which seems pretty surprising. He indicates, we conducted the analysis presented in this report to determine a structurally safe level of acceptable additional building settlement and tilt that it will not compromise the ability of the existing building to resist a major earthquake. And he says you can have 79 inches of tilt in the west direction and 33 inches to the north, and everything is going to be just fine. He makes this additional statement. Hamburger said that outside of addressing the sinking and tilting issues, the project also made the structure more earthquake resistant. As part of the building permit process imposed by San Francisco, the tower is subject to a 10-year monitoring plan with surveying and measurements periodically recorded and sent to city officials. So they started these monitoring reports in May of 2021. So presumably this will continue till May of 2031. They started out issuing weekly reports, but then they've curtailed that quite a bit, and I'll show you the details associated with that. So again, what Hamburger is saying is, hey, we really didn't need to do anything here. This building's fine with all the settlement, but we thought, we'd increase the seismic performance of the building. Now, during the installation of these so-called repair pile, these perimeter pile that were to extend all the way to bedrock, they greatly increased the amount of settlement and tilt of the building. So contrary to what they're trying to implement with their repair, they actually made things worse. So this was a statement made by Hamburger, as reported by Engineering News Record. We did not anticipate the pile installation would cause additional movement, but we were proactive about it, says Hamburger, who halted the repairs voluntarily in August 2021 so the team could develop a revamped pile driving method that would not accelerate settlement. Well, how can you be proactive when you're, in fact, being reactive? I've mentioned that before. But I mean, again, in my opinion, it doesn't seem to matter what happens. They've got a story like, that's consistently nothing to see here. Everything's fine. The engineer who's predicting how this building's going to perform, particularly in an earthquake, is telling people, we didn't know that was going to happen when we removed all this soil to pre-bore for the piling, when it was obvious to many people that that's what exactly would happen. So why would the design team, as represented by Ron Hamburger, not seem to care essentially what happens in terms of these monitoring results about the tilt and settlement of the building? It's because it was a political repair. It's a repair that apparently they don't even believe in. It was done to stabilize the real estate prices of these units. Here's a quote. Hamburger told San Francisco Gate on Thursday that he maintains the building is stable and safe and the current work is not even needed from a technical perspective. The HOA has always made it clear that although the voluntary upgrade was not required, it is interested in restoring the building's reputation damaged primarily by erroneous media reports, Hamburger said. Well, what did the media get wrong? They've been factually reporting the amount of building settlement and tilt. Hamburger admitted that settlement and tilt got worse in the repair efforts that he had not anticipated. He made other statements trying to blame it on the contractor doing the repair work, that, hey, that was their deal. We did the design. They were responsible for implementing it, which, again, is contrary to my experience. If you're the design engineer, you have to anticipate the means and methods that are going to be used. And in fact, you can insist on reviewing those means and methods so that it doesn't have additional detrimental impact on the building that you're trying to stabilize. And to close out the statement, this reputation may be affecting the value of the condos in the luxury high-rise. KPIX reported that 13 listings in the tower either expired or were taken off the market this year. So if that's the name of the game, stabilize the real estate prices, the plan seems to be, hey, it doesn't matter what the monitoring tells us. We're going to say it's good because really we didn't need to do anything anyway. Now let's look at the specifics of this additional settlement near the center of the building that was reported by NBC Bay Area. So for comparison, I'm going to go to June 28th, 2023 report. So this is the monitoring that started immediately following the completion of the installation of the 18 perimeter piling. And then I'm going to compare it to the most recent report, which is January 11th, 2024. Here we are. I'm recording this on February 26th, 2024. I don't know why there hasn't been a report issued since the middle of January. But let's look at a couple of points here. These rectangular areas are the vaults where they installed these 18 perimeter piling. If you're able to count these circles, there's 18 of them representing the pile locations. And you can see the current settlement reading. So what we have here are contours of settlement at these various locations throughout the foundation. The plot on the left is current through January 8th of this year, 2024, and the plot on the right is current through June, end of June 2023. So let's pick a point here. Let's look at this SM33. We could see it's about 2.1 inches here. Same back in June. But if we go down to, let's look at SM21, just under an inch. Over SM21 last June, about 0.9 inches. So yes, we can see in fact that the center is continuing to settle, even though the perimeter locations near these so-called repair pile have largely stopped settling, which is what you would expect. So we have a concentration of stresses transferred from the mat foundation to the perimeter piling in particular, which the loading on these pile is decreasing over time. And I've talked about that in previous videos. It's one of their action items that they're quickly approaching. And presumably when they hit that target, they're going to have to reapply the loading to the foundation, which can make things worse. It appears that the load is transferring in a localized fashion from the perimeter of the mat to these piling, but the rest of the building is transferring more of its load directly to the original piling and not to these perimeter pile, because again, the foundation obviously isn't sufficiently rigid to distribute as much loading to the perimeter piling as the designers would have liked. So they talked about getting 4 inches of tilt recovery. They only got 1. That tilt recovery is stopped. As was mentioned in that video segment from NBC News, Bay Area News, another geotechnical engineer, Bob Pike, has mentioned that there's an underground wall that was installed to reduce the impacts of construction dewatering, and that wall seems to be hanging up settlement on the other side of the building, opposite of these 18 perimeter piling. So essentially, the building's hung up on 2 sides, and the only place it can continue to settle is the middle of the building. And that settlement can cause cracking of that mat. It could allow water to run in and corrode reinforcing steel. It's a worrisome situation, to say the least, notwithstanding the potential impacts to degrading the seismic performance of this mat foundation during an earthquake. So here's this plot. Oddly, I mentioned they haven't published a monitoring report since the middle of January 2024. But even in that report, the data for the load cells for these perimeter piling went back to the middle of December. So they haven't updated that. Apparently there's been some type of equipment malfunction that presumably has been resolved, but we won't know that until the next monitoring report comes out. And I'm not sure when that's going to be. I'm not sure why it's been delayed 6 weeks. If you go back to when monitoring started for this building in May of 2021, they hadn't gone more than about a 2-week period between issuing reports. So I'm not sure what's going on. So that just shows us this is the banner for the website at the city of San Francisco where they're posting these reports. And again, as of the recording of this video on February 26th, the most current report is report 129, and that's dated January 11th, 2024. Now, I was talking about how the narrative is all important relative to getting these owners of these units some recovery in their real estate prices. The developer has gone to great lengths to control the narrative as well. He commissioned a study that was published in ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers, and it was more or less presented as a case history. They're going to go into all the design and performance issues for this building and conclude what had happened. And they basically whitewashed the whole issue of the original problems with the foundation design, having piling that only extended about 80 feet below grade. And I think that's a serious shortcoming of this study. You can decide for yourself if you think that that study was compromised because it was being funded by the developer. But an agency or an organization like ASCE, who's supposed to be independent, supposed to be promoting the highest ethical and technical output from professional engineers, civil engineers, that's a serious omission to say, they kind of blew it with the original foundation design. This should have gone all the way to bedrock, or they could have exonerated the original designer and said, they thought it was going to be one type of building and it was another, and that's what caused all this settlement. Either way, this would have reflected poorly on the developer, in my opinion, the developer who was funding the study. So those kind of examinations were omitted from this report. So to summarize, it doesn't seem to matter what kind of monitoring data comes out of this building, Matt Foundation. And Ron Hamburger, the designer for the so-called fix, seems to have an explanation for everything, even if it's contrary to what he's said in the past. Again, if you take them at their word that they didn't need to do this repair, they just did it to try and improve real estate prices, then again, I don't think they seem to care what happens with the actual monitoring data. So what's the point? I'd like to see the city of San Francisco require detailed analysis in these monitoring reports to explain exactly what's going on, what, if anything, people should be worried about, particularly the tenants of this building or the owners of these units. So I'd like to send a shout out to the channel members. I really appreciate your support. They get a sneak preview at least a day in advance typically of my videos before they go public. I'd also like to send a shout out to those who have provided super thanks. That's another great means of support. And of course, I'd like to thank those of you who have liked, subscribed, and commented on these videos. I'm really happy with the growth of the channel and the interaction. So it's been great. I appreciate it. Also, don't forget about the downloadable guide. There's a link in the description where I talk about the biggest civil engineering disasters of the past 100 years. Thanks very much, everybody.